Hey everybody, it's Janae here. So I am back. Earlier today I made a video and I did a reading, the book Alice's Adventure in Wonderland and the Looking Glass. So I'm back. I mentioned I would come back to pick up where I left off. So I am back and I am getting ready to pick up where I left off and continue reading, finishing my reading for today. So my expectation is to be here for about an hour and 30 minutes. So it's going to take about that long. Again, I'm just picking up where I left off. So feel free to join me. If you go to the introduction, that's where I am. So number 5 is decoding nonsense, decoding the child. So it says it at the top after introduction. So if you go to number 5, it says decoding nonsense, decoding the child. And once you get there, you'll see like a shape of a nose. So a nose is long, and then turn the page. So on the next page, in the first paragraph, that's where I'm going to pick up. So I kind of started doing some reading already. So I'm just going to pick up where I left off. So if you go there, number 5, decoding nonsense, decoding the child, you'll see a picture of a nose on the opposite side of the page, and then just turn the page and go to the second paragraph. So that's if you want to follow along with the book. All right. Just make sure my volume's off on my phone. I hope y'all having a good evening tonight. Let me see. Okay. All right, so phone is on vibrate. Go ahead and silence my phone so I don't have distractions. All right, y'all on that page, feel free to type in the chat. I'll start by saying hello. All right. So in contrast to the letters to his sister signed C.L. Dachshund over the signature of Lewis Carroll, the writer engages in the kind of extravagant but weirdly perverse nonsense that characterizes so many of his letters to his child's friends. Like so much of Dachshund's nonsense, however, this is not only a nonsense letter, but a letter about nonsense. The gags depends on the questions of naming and intending and involve implausible acts of encoding and decoding. It begins with a joke about a nameless sort of nose, and then an innuendo-style allusion of Dachshund's kissing another office, this time renamed the girl's mouth, which is here represented in code by the whisper goodbye into an ear, which is just above her chin. What follows is an observed dialogue between the two men and what the girl's behavior mean, conducted entirely in terms of single letters, which are presumed to stand for unsaid but implicitly understood sentences. The comedy turns on verbs of constructing and interpreting. I know he meant meaning, of course. I couldn't make out what he meant, and so on. Dachshund turns his farewell to the girl on the train into a kind of everyday hermeneutic farce based on the idea of imputed, concealed, and deciphered meanings that are attributed to the hissing sounds or letter S. We are close here to the strange idea Dachshund expresses everywhere of an innocent conversation in ordinary English that might mean something horrendous. In another language, the crotchety tone of the interlocutor Hatide B is reminiscent of the querulous creatures Alice encounters on her adventures. And what is satirized here is the confidence of both parties, and they know what the other means. The letter writer is told his head is empty, but whether this language is empty or full of significance remains in question. The jokes about telling the police at the end declares this is all innocent fun, but also telling invokes the idea of guilt and the law. What fascinates Dachshund is in all this is the idea of nonsense as a code, a secret language which in the letter is that which he shares with his reader Edith Jebb, but which depends on meanings which they cannot fully share and which remains indecipherable, held in brackets as it were, like the interpretations of the code offered by the writer of the letter. This is to make heavy weather of some light-hearted playing about, but the joke letter makes light of some complicated interpretive maneuvers and shows us something on which the Alice books depend. Dachshund's assumptions that children are interested in the comedy of meaning itself. So, having sent off another letter to his sister, praying for present and furniture blessings for her son at his baptism, he writes a second note to Edith, addressing her as my poor, dear, puzzled child. I won't write you such a hard letter another time. You can't you really guess what the gentleman meant when he said, your head is empty? Suppose I were to say that to you. Edith, my dear, my cup is empty. Will you be so kind to fill it with tea? Shouldn't you understand what I meant? Remember it loud and try again. We all switch linguistic register and degrees of seriousness in our conversation and letters, especially when we shift between addressing adults and children. Nevertheless, the switch in Dachshund's case is marked in an unusual degree and plays a structural role in the way he organizes his life and writings. In his letter to his sister, we hear the author of Alice, the puzzling creature of games and dreams for a dear puzzled child. The cup is empty is relatively easy to decode, but the sense of the apparently emptied letter has to be deciphered on quite different lines to those required to decode SSSS in the earlier letter. They aren't a phonetic pun, but a series of initial letters which the letter writer construes as abbreviations for utterly disparate terms. At the end of after some jokes about the exchange of letters between them, Dachshund asks Edith for her other names so that he might make a monograph for her for writing all the initials at once. Another play on isolating initial letters and devising new patterns for them. This, of course, is one of Dachshund's specialties, as his many acrostic verses of the names of child friends illustrate, not least the final poem of Through the Looking Glass, where the initial letters of each line spell the full name of Alice Pleasance Liddell. The letter is partly about letter writing in the usual sense, a subject that preoccupied Dachshund, who later published 8 or 9 wise words about letter writing to accompany the Wonderland stamp case in 1888. It is largely taken up with the writing of alphabetical letters such as MT as a code for other things. Such empty play is obviously full of meaning for the figure who signs himself in one letter, yours affectionately, Lewis Carroll, and in the other with another abbreviation, ever yours aptly, C.L. Dachshund. My reading of the letter is undoubtedly pandic, but so was Dachshund. As Oxford, Donne, and children's writers too, making a dear child puzzled was a central thread in Dachshund's puzzling relationships with children, and clearly this is central to the Alice stories. It is Alice's combination of curiosity, carouser indeed, and puzzlement which offers the reader a mirror through which to read the nonsense she encounters, quite as much as Maisie and Henry James's What Maisie Knew. Alice is engaged in a quest to interpret and master the complex and strange phenomenon of a largely adult world she encounters. There are no other children in her dream. What Alice knows and how she interprets it holds true century stage, giving her the paradoxical intellectual authority. In his letter to Edith Jebb, as apparently in many of his relationships with children, Dachshund engineers a semantic equivalent of a sado masochistic 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 relationship between himself as powerful adult creator of puzzles and the poor dear puzzle girl who encounters them. Yet in the books where variations of the same scenario occur in every episode, the same psychic economy produces a different psychological and literary effect. The adults in the stories, the March Hare, the Duchess, Humpty Dumpty, and the Red Queen are, for all their bossiness and superiority, shown up as perverse and childish weirdos, recognizable contemporaries of Dickens's Quilp, Scrooge, Miss Havisham, and Mr. Dick, and creating Alice's dream and making it a century of the books. Dachshund found not only a fertile channel for his genius for nonsense, but transformed the way it might be meaningful. Alice, even as a 7-year-old, emerges as more than equal to her intellectual as well as her social adventures, more than equal to bullying interlocutors such as Humpty Dumpty, the first bona fide philosopher of nonsense. His presumptuous boast, when I use a word, it means just what I chose it to mean, provokes Alice's retort. The question is whether you can make words mean so many different things. Not to be faced, Dumpty realized. The question is which is to be master, that's all. The Alice books mean many different things, as the huge critical literature they have inspired makes clear, but Alice's struggle for mastery and meaning is at their century. So this is clear from the vertiginous start of Wonderland, where Alice, inspired by her curiosity, that key word in the book, follows the rabbit underground. During the fall down deep well, Alice sees cupboards and bookshelves flash by, maps and pictures hung up on pegs and neatly labeled jars, one marked orange marmalade. As she falls, she calls up snippets learned in geography, lessons in the school, and enjoys the consolation of nice grand words to say, like latitude or longitude. At the end of the dreamly time suspended fall, she comes to earth with a thump and a heat of sticks and dry leaves, maps, pictures, labels, words. Alice free falls, takes her through the models of linguistic order she has learned at home and in the schoolroom. In her dream adventures, she tools cease such tools cease to offer stability, yet they are never lost sight of, and the world she travels through is always composed of language. Comically transfigured, it is nevertheless built out of familiar educational and social world of a middle class child of her time. The playing cards and chess pieces, which provide the narrative coherence for her dream, have no supernatural or magical dimension. They are part of a familiar rule bound household games. Despite the label fairy tale, there are no fairies or supernatural powers in Alice's book, such as you find in the children's fiction of those other religious dons. George MacDonald and C.S. Lewis. Alice clings on to her received codes even as they are put under pressure from all sides. She keeps her composure as best she can as she travels through the discomposed linguistic halls of mirrors, which are her dreams. As she says to the discouragingly moralistic, ugly Duchess, I've a right to think. Dachshund was a logician with a taste for children, and he brings his professional thinking about questions of meaning to bear upon his fascination with childhood. The result is a fairy tale about a 7-year-old, which is not only an adventure story, but a philosophical joke book, a mixture of genially Croquet pantomime and serial Socratic dialogue, despite the mind bending series of jokes about language and logic. However, this is not a philosophical um, divertisement disguised as a children's book. And if Alice is subjected to perverse logical jokes, the joke is never on Alice. You shouldn't make jokes. Alice tells the net. If you make if they make you so unhappy and the jokes other creatures tell, she makes none herself and she doesn't generally seem to find other people's very funny. Don't make her happy either. They do, however, enlarge her our sense of the people and our sense of the people ways the world and words have meaning. Dachshund's genius was to make the construction of meaning an intrinsic part of the narrative of the child's dream experience, like latter books such as The Game of Logic and its difference way. They assume that the idea of its meaning is meaningful to children. The publication of Alice books marks the watershed in the literature about childhood as well as children's literature. For all their originality, they are a product of culture, which a huge and developing investment in the idea of childhood. Childhood had began to play an increasing role in the adult fiction of the period. Charlotte Bronte, Jane Eyre, Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, and Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist, 1837, Dombey and Son, 1848, David Copperfield, 1850, and The Great Expectations, 1861, all play a large part in colonizing modern childhood for literary representation. During the same period, a new literature for children rapidly developed. In 1820, Taylor translation of the Grimm brothers' household tales acted as an open sesame, and Lewis Carroll thoroughly modern transformation of the traditional fairy tale in Alice's book is part of much broader development of writing specifically directed at children in the Victorian period, much of it associated with the major writers of the time, Edward Lear's Book of Nonsense, and appeared in 1846, Dickens's A Christmas Carol in 1843, a Thackeray's Patsy Fairy Tale, Patsy Fairy Tale, The Rose and Ring in 1854 all helped to clear the way for Carolinian nonsense. Dodson gave the Liddell girls a copy of Catherine Sinclair's Holiday House for Christmas in 1861, read Christina Rossetti's Goblin Market when it came out in 1862, and the MS of his friend George MacDonald's Exquisite Light Princess in the same year, while 1863 was the year. So the Water Babies of Charles Kingsley appeared. Dodson met him in 1869. MacDonald at the Back of the North Wind, 1871, appeared the same year as Through the Looking Glass and The Princess and the Goblin. Following year, by the end of life, Dodson had collected a series of other books on the Alice model, as he notes in his diary. Got Mabel Remoulade by Edward Holland. As part of the collection, I intended making of books of the Alice type. Besides this, I have From Nowhere to the North Pole by young Todd Hood, Alice's Expedition by F.E. Weatherly, and A Trip to Wonderland by Jambone, and Wanted a King by Maggie Brownie. One more book I have added, The Story of a Nursery Rhyme. So by the end of the century, Twine, Francis Hodgson, Burnett, Stevenson, and Kipling had extended the scope of children's literature further, but Dodson had every reason to be conscious about the importance of his own work in this development. So Alice's books combined modern and romance elements, psychological and comedy in a highly original, liberating way that his home was the real world of Victorian childhood, and the one hand, and the kinds of meanings coded in fantastic fairy tales on the other, and had no truck with ugly didactism. I'm going to look that word up, y'all. I know it's going live. All right, so I don't even know how to really say that word. I feel like I'm just reading words in a book. Okay. I'm so smart. So let me see. Did I lose my spot? So unfortunately, I'm not. That's weird. Let's go back live. All right, so I was not able to hear the sound of the word, but I do have a definition. A congenital defect in which there are only 2 digits on the hand or foot. Is that the right word? I feel tired. Didactism? Associated with Ugly Duchess, everything got moral if only you can find it. This brings us back to the altercation between Alice and the Red Queen with which we began. I'm sure I didn't mean Alice was beginning, but the Red Queen interrupted her impatiently. That's just what I complain of you. You should have meant. What do you suppose is the use of a child without any meaning? Even a joke should have some meaning. And a child's more important than a joke, I hope. You couldn't deny that, even if you tried with both hands. The nonsense jokes and jokes about meanings in particular get their resonance in the end because of the importance of the child's experience of the constitution of meaning in which she is caught up. Dodgson was frightened of the best sources of jokes, sex, and religion, and worked hard to keep his writings untainted by even the faintest humorous allusions to either. Nevertheless, the jokes the child Alice encounters makes free with the most important issues of her world. So food and the food chain, growing and aging, manners and madness, childhood and adulthood, freedom and rules, authority and identity. It was only in the Twine Alice books and the haunting of the snark of the same period that Dodgson found a medium to explore his puzzling temperament with his and malice investments in young girls and questions of meaning. In these works, he transformed the perverse imagination into works of art that have not only survived their moment, but have gone on to generate new meanings with every generation of readers, enlarging the possibilities not only of children literature, but all literature. As the countless subsequent interpretation, translations, and adaptations show, Alice's adventures continues and are to be continued. So there's some notes here. It says the Lobster Quadrille, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, Chapter 10, Queen Alice Through the Looking Glass, Chapter 9, AAIW, Chapter 12, TLG, Chapter 1, AAIW 12, TLG, Chapter 6, R.L. Green, Introduction, Alice Adventures in the Wonderland Through the Looking Glass, Oxford, 1982, William Empson, Martin Gardner. I'm just skipping down. So on this, C.Q. Huggington, so the introduction, Cato Book and Nonsense Poetry, London, 1988, J.S. Arthon Carroll, an unforeseen precursor, the books at the Wake, New York, 1960, Michael Hultquist, What is a Boojum? Nonsense in Modernism, Yale French Studies, volume XL 33, 1970. All right, so there's a bunch of notes here. So like if you want to like find out more about Pig and Pepper, then or AAIW says go to chapter 6. So if you want to know about Queen Alice, TLG, go to chapter 9. So these are just some notes for you. Like if you want to like go somewhere specific. So I'm going to turn the page. I'm still reading the introduction. And they have more notes, the same thing, type of thing on the next page and the following after that. So I'm just going to skip that. And then they have a little bit more on the next page and on the next page, which is good because I can just turn the page. So then you go to the further readings. So the works of Lewis Carroll. So if you're just joining, hi, I'm reading a book. So it's Alice. Whoops. Oh, now I closed the page. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. So this is what I'm reading. And I'm in the introduction. So I just skipped a few pages because I don't need to read it. It's just some notes, like if you want to go somewhere specific. So I'm turning the page to further readings, the works of Lewis Carroll. So it doesn't have like a chapter number, but that's where I'm going to start right now. So if you want to join, feel free. It's in Roman numeral numbers, so I don't really know that by heart. So I hope y'all can find it. All right, so works of Lewis. Oh, this is the works. So you know what? I'm not going to read this either because this is the works cited. So for example, it says the Diaries of Lewis Carroll, Roger Lancelin, Green, London, Cassell, and C.O. 1953. 2 VOLS. I think that's like volumes. 2 volumes. Okay, I don't know if that makes sense. The letters of Lewis Carroll, Ed Morton, and Cohen, with the assistance of Roger Lancey Green, London, Macmillan, 1979, 2nd volume. Lewis Carroll in the House of Macmillan, Ed Morton, North Cohen, and Anita Randolph, Cambridge University Press, 1987. The Complete Works, Ed Alexander, Wolcott, London, The Non-Such Press, 1939. Reprinted, Harmondsworth, Penguin Books, 1988. So it's like basically like a works cited page. All right, and so then he goes on to like the bibliography. So I'm going to skip that. I'm trying so hard to do this, you guys and gals. So then they get to like the critical information, and then they have a note on the text. So I will start there and read the note of the text. I think that might be helpful. So it looks like this. A note on the text. So there are numerous textual variants, and in the various edition of the 2 Alice books published in Carroll's lifetime and since his death, but Carroll's final revision of both texts for the 1897 edition remains the most authoritative in the view of most Carroll scholars. This, with a few modifications, is the text used here. The textual history has been exhaustively dealt with by Thelman, Godacre, and others. Goodacre, and others. In a series of articles in Jabberwocky, the Journal of Lewis Carroll Society, and elsewhere, Selwyn Godacre has itemized and analyzed and numerous changes and typographical errors corrected and introduced in various editions supervised by Carroll during his lifetime. So in general, when Carroll revised his text in 1866 and in 1897, in particular, he left the details of phraseology of the story almost wholly intact, but fiddled with its punctuation and presentation. In revising the published text, he seems almost exclusively concerned with placing of dots, dashes, and commas. He was not interested in improving or reshaping the literary material itself, only when polishing its presentations and buttoning up his already fastidious conventions regarding quotations, italizations, and hyphenations. Carroll was always fussy about the representation of speech in the text and in the stage versions, and much of the worrying about punctuation stems from this. His particular bugbear concerned the punctuation in sentences in inverted commas quoted within the text were to put the stops and commas, and the fidget over italics is related to this concern with the relationship between textual and the oral and the written and the spoken text. Hypertension was a particular hobby horse of his through the latest text, of the book is probably the fussiest as regards punctuation. Carroll was always one of the pretty precise of all English writers, and the pedantic elaboration of his textual presentation contributions to his peculiar brand of impeccable and deadpan surrealism. Lewis Carroll rejected the first edition of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland in 1865 in large part because of Tenniel's dissatisfaction with the quality of the printed illustrations. Having withdrawn the edition from circulation, he brought out a second edition the following year in 1866. In his account of the reason for his drastic action, W.H. Bond records that a collection of the text shows 70 points of difference, most of them relatively insignificant, of which 59 may represent the author's revision. Putting the question of the illustrations aside, there is only one instance of real verbal revision, as Bond notes in the incident where Alice is left holding the baby, which turns into a pig. Her remark that it would have been a dreadful ugly child becomes it. So putting the question of the illustrations aside, there is only one instance of real verbal revision, as Bond notes in the incident where Alice is left holding the baby, which turns into a pig. Her remark that it would have been a dreadfully ugly child because it would have made a it would have been a dreadfully ugly child. That part of Carroll used the opportunity of another edition to be tidied up the text here and there, adding and deleting commas, adding hyphens. Seashore becomes seashore, flower beds, and correcting the odd misprint, bringing the twinkle back to twinkle. For example, despite the drastic decision to recall that first 1865 book, there are very few obvious differences between it and the second edition. The popularity of Alice was such that in November 1866, Macmillan issued another 3,000 copies in a slightly smaller size, and for this reissue, as Selwyn Godacre had documented. I'm going to look up that word. Sorry. Reissue. Reissue? It's almost like resume. Let's see how to pronounce it.
Reissue.
Oh, reissue. Sorry. So something that is issued again. So it's reissued. Sorry. There's like a dash. And so you have like part of the word. You have the REIS, and then there's a dash. And then you have the SUE. So I kept saying reissue, but it's reissue. So I almost had it. I think I said that reissue. Okay. So reissue, as Selwyn Godacre had documented. Carroll again revised the text. This was another small-scale revision, which was almost entirely confined to punctuation. As Godacre notes, it showed a gradual implementation of the Carolinian fondness of hyphenated words. The whole in one mouse hole, for example, becomes a two-stroke mouse hole, and the liberal addition of commas. So there are some spelling changes, such as toffee, Toffy, and toffee, Toffee. A change in Carol was to reverse in 1897 and a couple of grammatical twitches. She felt it ought to be treated with respect becomes the more grammatical respectable. She felt that it ought to be treated with respect and that haters rather noddedly conquil. I hadn't but just begun becomes the plainer I hadn't begun. Most of these changes were retained in later editions. In addition to the various verbal readjustments, two illustrations were moved from the gutter position to the outer side of the page. So those of the card gardeners and Alice with the flamingo mallet, they remained there in all subsequent editions. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland was thereafter and thoroughly revised again with Looking Glass in the final corrected edition of 1897. Through the Looking Glass was first published in December 1871 with the title page dated 1872 and was not fully revised until some 61,000. This was published in December 1896 but dated 1897 and was effectively, as Dennis Crutch notes, its second edition until the date, with the exception of alterations to the preliminary and matter. The text was to all intents identical, being printed from electrotypes made in 1871. All right. So in September 1896, Carol borrowed a bound up copy of the two Alice books. So Wonderland 1882, Looking Glass 1880, from the former child friend May Barber, later Miss Strutton, and made manuscript corrections for amendments for the edition of 1897 when the books were wholly reset in the new type with a special preface dated Christmas 1896. The scale and importance of the 1897 revision of Carol's two classic texts were first documented by Stanley Goodman in the late 1950s. Goodman's article record Carol's correction in detail and notes that a study of a representative selection of the edition which have appeared since his death shows that the author's final interaction as represented by the corrections of Mrs. Stritton's copies and the 1897 edition based on them have rarely been respected in their entirety. More recently, Sweden Godacre has provided a more complete record of the extensive alteration to the 1897 text of Wonderland. All right, so in 1897, so revisions are generally along the same lines as the earlier, rather than additions for excisions of textual material. He changed can't and won't to a more laboriously accurate can't and won't throughout the multiplied and already multiple instances of hyperation that occur in each revision. So he gave instructions not only to convert the schoolroom into a school room and kid gloves into kid gloves. So KIDGLOVES into KID-GLOVES, which seems unexceptionable, but Cheshire pus into Cheshire pus. So CHESIRE pus PUSS into cashier dash pus. So CHESHIRE dash PUSS. Multiplication tables into multiplication dash table. So MULTIPLICAN dash TABLE, and even shepherd boy into shepherd dash boy, SHEPHERD dash BOY, which seem almost bizarre in their pursuit of correctness. Carol was obviously offended by nouns acting as adjectives, qualifiers, or other nouns, so committed himself to further oddities such as winter dash day, WINTER dash DAY, and railway dash station, RAILWAY dash STATION 2. He also at this stage came to insist that an exclamation mark finishes a sentence such as hush, HUSH, exclamation mark, HUSH, exclamation mark, became HUSH, exclamation mark, capital HUSH, exclamation mark. And alas, ALAS, exclamation mark, it was too late, became ALAS, exclamation mark, it was too late. So capital IT was too late. So some of the gender terms that are applied to the century also got altered in this revision so that the mouse's tail is changed from his tail to its tail, and Dodo referred to as he rather than an it, and the dormouse changed from he to it throughout the Tea Party, though he survives as a male in the trial scene. As to spelling, toffee reverts back to toffee of the original manuscript. So apart from this characteristic punctual fidgeting, toward correctness and consistency never fully realized since certain inconsistencies remain. Despite his best efforts, Carroll made a number of tiny additions to the narrative. In this edition, Shakespeare is said to have stood rather than sat in the pictures of him. For example, the most significant changes are a few minutes before telling touches added to the dialogue and stage direction of the trial scene in Wonderland. So they include changing. So these were the verses, the White Rabbit read to, so there was dead silence in the court, whistled the White Rabbit, read out these verses, and adding a couple of further interpretations of the evidence by the king. So if she should push the matter on, that must be the queen. What would become of you? What indeed? Perhaps Carol's sense of theater has been sharpened by seeing the stories performed. The other significant addition was certainly a result of the artificial experiences. So I'm going to stop. My eyes are burning. I am making food and I'm tired. So I chopped up some onions. So my eyes are a little bit burning. Like I washed my eyes, but I still feel like my eyes are bothering me and I feel tired a little bit. And I don't really know what I'm reading, but I'm going to finish this page. So this edition incorporated with 2 revisions. So there's 2 revisions. There's the TLG marked in the revised copy text Carol sent the printers for the 1897 edition, which Stanley Goodman noted had not been incorporated into the final text. So these are a peculiar arresting comma after the first word in the penultimate stanza of Jabberwocky, and has thou slain the Jabberwock. And a smother final E on smooth in Queen Alice. So smooth her hair, lend her your nightcap. I have also silently modified a very small number of errors of punctuation, such as unclosed inverted commas, reinstated the dramatis personae, the TLG, which formed part of the 1872 and the early editions, but the omitted in 1897, and put the 1896 Christmas preface to both books in the appendices. Otherwise, the text that is of the last edition, Carol supervised through the press. Okay, so then there's the Tenniel. So a note on Tenniel. Alice's adventures are propelled by her dissatisfaction with the book her sister is reading, which has no pictures or conversation in it. Though Dachshund produced his own homemade illustrations for the original Alice's Adventures Underground, when he decided to have it published, he was intended from the outset on hiring a first-rate illustrator to provide the pictures accompanying his own conversation. At the end of 1863, he wrote to his friend Tom Taylor, a Punch journalist and popular dramatist, to ask his advice on the matter. Do you know Mr. Tenniel well enough to say whether he could undertake such a thing as drawing a dozen of woodcuts to illustrate a child's book? And if so, could you put me into communication with him? The reason for which I ask are that I have written such a tale for a young friend and illustrated it in pen and ink. It has been read and liked by so many children, and I have been asked so often to publish it, and I have decided on doing so. I've tried my hand and writing on the wood, and some to the conclusion that it would take much more time than I can afford, and the result would not be satisfied after all. I want some figure pictures done in pure outline, or nearly so, and all of the artists on wood. I should prefer Mr. Tenniel, if he should be willing to undertake them. I would not send him the book to look over, not that he should at all follow my pictures, but simply to give him an idea of the sort of thing I want. I should be much obliged if you would find out for me what he thinks of it. Since 1850, John Tenniel, 1820, 1914, had been a principal cartoonist for Punch and was already a successful book illustrator. The contributions to numerous anthologies and storybooks and complete illustrations of Dalla Mati Facque Undine, 1845, Aesop's Fables, 1848, and Thomas More's La Roque, 1861. Dachshund finally got in touch with his preferred illustrator himself on 25th January 1864. As Dachshund recorded in his diary, Tenniel seemed to think favorably of undertaking the pictures, but he wanted to see the book before deciding. He must have approved of what he saw, and on 5 April, he agreed to do the pictures. Despite the pressure of personal troubles, his mother was ill, and other commissions, he was not only producing his weekly copy for Punch, but about 6 pictures for RH, Barham's Ingoldsby Legends 1864, and other Dzieil's Arabian Nights 1865. Dachshund sent the first slips less than a month later in early May and found Tenniel's slow progress immensely frustrating. It seems probable that Tenniel saw Dachshund's own illustration, and as the text grew, Carroll sent him through sketches and even occasional photographs of models, as well as suggesting numerous alterations and additions to Tenniel's first draft. Given both men were obsessive perfectionists with strong ideas of their own, it was a protracted and difficult as well as a productive collaborative process. Tenniel sent back the first 12 proofs complete in December. His first picture was for the Pool of Tears, while the last proofs did not arrive until June 1865. When the book came back from the printers in July that year, Dachshund heard that Tenniel was dissatisfied with the state of the pictures. It is a sign of the perfectionist Dachshund committed to the visual entire first edition, and at his own expense, ordered a complete reprint in August. The new impression won Tenniel's approval in November, and the book was published for Christmas 1865 through the Athenaeum. Thought the illustration square and grime and uncouth. Most reviewers and readers sided with the Times, which said he had illustrated the story with extraordinary grace. It was a measure of the success of the initial double act that when Dachshund finished the sequel Through the Looking Glass a few years later, having first read Richard Doley isn't good enough, he told Mrs. MacDonald and then Noble Paton. He approached Tenniel once again, and after some initial reluctance to renew the trouble-making collaboration with a picky author of Alice, the illustrator was eventually persuaded in 1868 to do so, provided he could do them in his own time. The second volume of Alice will, after all, be illustrated by Tenniel, who it has reluctantly consented, as his hands are full. Henceforth, however various her subsequent reincarnation on pages, stage and screen, the face and fate of Dachshund Heronian has been inextricable intertwined with Tenniel's original image. Unfortunately, this particular collaboration between author and illustrator was never to be repeated, since Tenniel refused to have anything more to do with Dachshund after the experience of working on the Alice books with him, and Dachshund had to look elsewhere for illustrations to The Hunting of the Snark, Sylvie de Bruno, and its collections of verse. It took nearly 3 years for Tenniel to complete his 15 illustration. My eyes are burning. It took him 15 years to complete his Tenniel illustration. Oh my gosh. My eyes burning. My nose is stuffed. I feel like, yeah. So it took him Tenniel to complete the illustration for Through the Looking Glass, the 3 years of delay, correction, and negotiations between author, artists, and printers, in which Dodgson usually had the upper hand, though he accepted a number of suggestions by Tenniel, such as making a walrus companion a carpenter rather than a butterfly or baronet, and making Alice grab the goat's beard rather than the old lady's hair in the carriage scene. Though when the book was published in 1871, it was another triumph, one of the high points in the artist's career. Tenniel later wrote that it is a curious fact that through the looking glass, the faculty of making drawings for the book illustrations parted from me, and notwithstanding all sorts of tempting inducements, I have done nothing in that direction since. When Harry Furness agreed to illustrate Sylvie and Bruno, Tenniel told him that Lewis Carroll is impossible. Nevertheless, while it lasted, their partnership resulted in one of the most memorable, successful combinations of the image and text in the history of English book production. The Alice books were published during perhaps the most self-conscious and richly productive period of English printed books illustration. So, following in the wake of George Cruikshank's pioneering illustrations to the Brothers Grimm's household tales of Charles Dickinson, Oliver Twist, Hobo Brownie under the pseudonym of Fitz, provided densely detailed illustration over 10 novels by Dickens and innumerable works by contemporaries, making book illustrations integral to contemporary fiction as well as to the publication of anthologies of tales and poems, ancient and modern, in the period. This was a period of the great illustrations associated with Punch, not only Tenniel, but Richard Doley, John Leech, Charles Nee, George de Morar, and also heyday and pro-Raphaelitism, in which Arthur Hughes, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and Milius provide illustration not only for the early literature, but for contemporary writers such as George MacDonald, Christina Rossetti, Trollope, and Tennyson. Luckily for Alice, with her predilection of books with pictures in them, text and images were probably more closely allied during the Victorian period than at any other time since the Middle Ages. Dodgson was an enthusiastic follower of contemporary arts. He photographed many famous artists of the day, possessed the pre-Raphaelite periodical for Germ own painting, and Rossetti and Arthur Hughes photographed drawings, and Burnet Jones and Rossetti and his library indicates a developed taste for illustrated books of both the early generations of Gilray, Shea Moore, and Cruikshank, and contemporaries such as Rich Doley, illustrator of Ruskin's The King of the Golden River. Noel Paton, in particular, his Shakespeare illustrations, and the later work of children's artists such as Randolph Caldecott and T. Pyne, an early imitator of Kate Greenaway's. In opting for John Tenniel as illustrator for the story, he knew exactly what he was doing. Tenniel's early book of illustration shows the influence of the German and English Victorian medievalism, and in the Book of British Bald's 1842 as House of Gothic, in his versions of Pose and Raven. picturesque, Turcat, Orientalism, and his Lila Rook 1861 of the Dzil's Arabian Nights Entertainment 1863, and probably the satirical anthropomorphism of the brilliant French cartoonist Granville in his Aesop's. His retirement in 1901, Tenniel was the most influential visual artist of the period, combining a satire fantasy style with a solid circumstance grasp of the social and political details of the Victorian world. These cartoons were collected in books formed two as in the 4 volumes of the cartoon from Punch by John Tenniel, 1864 to 70, 1871, 1881, and 1882 to 91, and the Queen and Mr. Punch, 1897, and the cartoons by Sir John Tenniel, 1901. The combination of his early grotesque Punch style and the fashionable atmospheric medievalism of his series books illustrations, in addition to the meticulous anthropomorphism of the animal cartoons for Aesop and Punch, all contribute to the soberly fantastic idiom of the 2 Alice books. It is a strange irony that this talented and prolific graphic artist should be remembered not only exclusively for his contributions to 2 children's books, but his pictures bear the imprint of his board and solid experience in those other fields, enabling the illustrations, like the text, to infuse the fantastic tale of children, which strangely representation status as an expression of the Victorian age. So, though there has been numerous brilliant illustrators of the Alice books in the 20th century, by among others, author Rackham, Mervyn Peake, Salvador Dali, and Walt Disney, and Ralph Steadman, Carroll's text has reminded indissolubly bound up with original illustrations which appeared in the text published in his lifetime, while the exception of the 1886 Fast Mile of Alice Adventures Underground, Tenniel's illustration form an unacceptable complement and counterpart of Carroll's dream text and the reader's sense of the squarely down-to-earth daredream in her striped stockings and long brushed hair, and well as her various fabulous and incongruous interlocutors in the Wonderland and Beyond the Mirror. If the books are, among other things, portraits, galleries of the 19th century's eccentrics a la Dickens, then this is in large part due to Tenniel. His portraits of the White Rabbit and the Queen of Hearts, the Mad Hatter, the Ugly Duchess, the Brother Tweedle, the Walrus and the Carpenter, the White Knight, possibly a self-portrait of Humpty Dumpty, based on the sketch by Dachshund. Okay, I am so tired. So Tenniel has also fixed the memorable precision some of the more fantastic fauna of the Carolinian wonderlands, such as those phantasmal compound ghosts that mock Turtle and Jabberwocky and the Chronicle and the admirable prosaic density and social scenes of the Mad Tea Party of Duchess. Help me to read, Lord. The depiction of cards, chess pieces, and animals around the narratives revolve. Tennille's always manages to be true to their double nature as characters and the non-humans, fantastical figures of social types, above all, Tennille's graphic idioms. Help me to know how to read, Lord. So managers to create visual equivalent of the most uncomfortable, fantastic text relationship of the mid-19th century Britain to the anchor of the solid ground of the bourgeois public and domestic world and its comfortable self-representation. Tennille's image of Alice feelings her way through the solid reflection surface of the looking glass into the world of dizzying and stimbles and grotesque metamorphoses beyond the beautiful instance of the art of the most expansive attune in Carol's text. It can also stand as an expressive emblem of the illustrator's contribution of Alice's book in pictures and conversations. So that's basically it. So I'm just going to stop there. And from there, it goes on to Alice's Adventure in the Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. So then it just goes into the actual story. And then like you have like the beginning of the story, like the actual beginning. And so there's two sides. We found out in the introduction that there's two sides to the story. There's a poem here. It says, all in the golden afternoon, full luxuriously would glide, for both hours with little skill. By little arms are piled, and little hands make vain pretense our wanderings to guide. A cruel three, in such an hour, beneath such dreamy weather, to beg a tale of breath too weak to stir the tiniest feather. Yet what can one poor voice avail against three tongues together? Imperious Prima flashes forth her edict to being it in gentler tones. Secunda hopes there will be nonsense in it, while Tertia interrupts the tale no more than once a minute. Anon to sudden silence one. In fancy they pursue the dream child moving through a land of wonders wild and new, in friendly chat with birds or beasts, and half believe it true. And ever as the story drained the wells of fancy dry, the faintly strove that weary one to put the subject by. The rest next time, it is next time, the happy voices cry. Thus grew the tale of Wonderland, thus slowly one by one. Its quaint events was hammered out, and now the tale is done. And home we steer, a merry crew beneath the setting sun. Alice a childish story take, and with a gentle hand lay it where childhood's dreams are twined, and memory majestic band. Like pilgrims withered, weathered a flower plucked in a far-off land. And then that's the end. And then you go into the contents. And then so the first one is like the rabbit hole. So down the rabbit hole. And then you finally go into Down the Rabbit Hole, Chapter 1. So that was the introduction. So in the introduction, we basically found out that there's more than one side of the story. So there's going to be two different sides, possibly three different sides of the story told in Alice in the Wonderland, and then you have Alice Through the Looking Glass. And so like with the stories, they're kind of told like a little bit different. Like the words that they use are like different. So like you may have, what's an example of some words that you might have? like goodbye, I guess. So instead of like GOODBYE, you might have GOOD-BYE. So like some of the words are kind of like spelled out different, and like some of the quotations are going to be like in different places, and it may have like a different meaning. And one of the stories you have it like where Alice goes down the hole, and then another one you have Alice that's looking through a glass. And so like the stories are like a little different, and like the words and their choice of the words are like a little bit different. And in the beginning I read a little bit about Dachshund, the father. So the father was the one that actually was interested in young girls. And so he would watch young girls and take pictures of them, take nude pictures of the young girls and take them down the river and up the mountain and take like 3 at a time and like have like nude pictures and like do different things or whatever. And like the parents like didn't like that. And like one of them wondered like I whether if the maybe the mom didn't really care for it because the man wasn't like a rich wealthy man. Like maybe if he was like rich and wealthy and high class, maybe she wouldn't mind. And this was in like the 19th century, so I guess it was okay for like an older man to have like a younger woman, whereas now like we kind of see like, oh, that's a pedophile, like that's not a good thing. So like they talked a little bit about that. So, and this man was also like a genius. He had like a stammering problem, so he stuttered, but he was also very, very bright in some ways. So he was a mathematician, he was a college professor, but since he loved kids, specifically girls, young girls so much, instead of being a professor, he ended up changing and like ended up working like with little kids and like ended up doing things relating to like writing children's stories and like doing things like relating to like young girls and stuff. So that's basically like this Alice. So Alice was his favorite. And so this is like what we're talking about, like Alice's adventures in Wonderland and Alice's through like the looking glass. And so like there's different sides to the story and everything. And so like that's basically like what I know this book to be about. I know there's a little bit about like drugs being added. So yeah, so I'm excited about this read, but I'm done with the introduction. So maybe I'll come back one day and read a little bit the story. So the story hopefully is much more interesting than the introduction, hopefully. Thank you for listening. Have a good night. Bye-bye.